welcome to book club. Oh goodness, Sorry, I've been setting up and then I just sat down and then went in live immediately. And I'm rather short. Hang on. Is that better? I think so. This is fine. I can move this along a little. There we go. Hello everybody, welcome to Jane Austen Book Club. How are we doing this week? I'm just going to grab my book. Catastrophic, thank you very much. I really like this hoodie, it is the softest thing in the world. I'm just going to grab my Discord. Which I have yet to ever remember to put up before I go live. So, we are reading Persuasion. We started it about 2 weeks ago, and then last Monday I was at a convention and massively, embarrassingly arrived at the convention at 6 p.m. and then completely forgot that I was supposed to be streaming in half an hour. And as it turned out, had almost no internet. As in, in the main building there was a lot, but in the particular cabin I was staying in, just no internet, no phone signal. I've basically been cut off from the internet for like a week, and it's actually been quite nice. Inconvenient, but not bad in other ways. But we are back. We are booking. So last time we were introduced to the Elliot family, and then we learned a lot about the archaic British class system and the aristocracy and the bottom of the aristocracy specifically. So we were introduced to Sir Walter Elliot, who is a baronet, and that is like the lowest level of the aristocracy that holds like any kind of power. He's not quite at the level where he's allowed to actually sit in Parliament. And we were introduced to his oldest daughter, Elizabeth. So both Elizabeth and Sir Walter are like very vain, very good looking, and kind of preening snobs. We know that he has another daughter, Mary, the youngest daughter, and that she is married to a man, like a gentleman who owns land nearby called Charles Musgrove. And then we were also introduced to his middle daughter, Anne Elliot, who is our protagonist. And Anne is very sensible, very kind-hearted, more reserved and considered plain by Sir Walter and Elizabeth, so they don't like her very much, they don't respect her. But although she lost her mother at quite a young age, her mother's best friend, Lady Russell, does live nearby. She is a widow, although a widow only of a knight, which is like a step below a baronet, so goodness, she's considered not quite as up high as the Elliots. She's like one step below. But she has been kind of like a mother, godmother, aunt kind of figure to Anne, and is very fond of her. Okay. Is there any, I feel like we spent a lot of time talking about the class system last time, and we're probably going to be talking a little bit more about the class system today, but I think that makes a fair amount of sense. Just having a bit of a drink. I've got some sparkling water. I don't know why, I always hated sparkling water, but a few years ago, I got travel sick in a car, had some sparkling water to take away the nausea. It worked brilliantly, and also I was just like, oh, it's water but fizzy. Now I'm really into it. Okay. Oh, I opened the book right at the precise page that we need. So, are we ready to start? We're on volume 1, chapter 2. Okay. Mr. Shepherd, a civil, cautious lawyer who, whatever might be his hold or his views on Sir Walter, would rather have the disagreeable prompted by anybody else. Okay, I should point out one other thing. The Elliots are in a lot of financial trouble. Turns out that Sir Walter and Elizabeth have been spending a lot of money, and more money than they have. So they are now very much in debt. And I should point out that being in debt and continuing to spend frivolously, continuing to get into more debt, was considered like a dishonourable, immoral, like dishonest thing back in the day, because so much trade was done based on credit, right? So Sir Walter would have an account with, say, the butcher locally, or some, well, he's probably got meat coming in from his own farms, but like the ones that he owns. But okay, so Walter has an account with, because he's quite a vain man, with the local hair gel guy. And the local hair gel guy will send boxes of hair gel to Sir Walter every month, and he will just take it on faith that Sir Walter will pay him, that money will come into him, because Sir Walter lives at Kellynch Hall, which is a fancy house. So Walter is the richest man in the area. So Walter is the head of the society, the local community. So Sir Walter, of course, will pay his bills. And the particular socioeconomic situation meant that it was very, very, very difficult for the local hair gel guy to at any point cut Sir Walter off from his supply of hair gel. So Sir Walter's just racking up this huger and huger and huger bill. He's basically got a big tab. He's running up tabs with everybody in town. And at no point is he paying them. And because if the hair gel guy wants to ever see that money and wants to ever be able to send hair gel to Sir Walter again, and Sir Walter's obviously buying it in huge quantities, if he says to Sir Walter, I can't send you any more hair gel until you pay me, he's lost all of that, which is a huge loss. So the way that business worked, thank you so much for my tea, the way that business worked basically meant that if you're kind of trading on your reputation, as a customer, you are trading on your reputation, and as a seller, you are trusting that people who seem like they can afford stuff will pay you for it. So to have a lot of like consumer debt was seen as like a dishonorable, almost a dishonest thing to do, because it's not like the people that you were in debt to had the money. It wasn't credit brokers that you were in debt to. It wasn't banks you were in debt to. It was the people sending you the stuff. It was the people selling you the stuff. And they didn't have that money. Yeah, exactly. People in the chat making some really good points here, like Compost Witch, your credit limit was determined by your social standing. Yes, absolutely. And yeah, Toys R Us, that's exactly it. Like, why lose the whole tab? And future tabs, for one, like, I need payment. So things had to get really, really, really extreme for that. I need payment. Because it's also not just why lose the whole tab, it's also if Sir Walter doesn't like you and he runs the town, essentially, socially, that's a problem. Yes, Kate B, it would be a huge scandal and socially a bad move and financially difficult for Hair Gel Guy to sue for payment, for the same reason that rich people tend to win lawsuits now, because Hair Gel Guy won't be able to pay for the legal system, and also because Sir Walter has social standing that Hair Gel Guy does not. Okay, so that is, I think it's important to get why it is such a problem that the Elliots are in debt. Like, it's not just bad for them, it's bad for everybody in their community. Or, well, loads of people in their community. Okay. I'll start the chapter again because we got barely anywhere. So, Mr. Shepherd is the Elliots' lawyer and is, like, advising them on the situation. Mr. Shepherd, a civil, cautious lawyer who, whatever might be his hold or his views on Sir Walter, would rather have the disagreeable prompted by anybody else, excused himself from offering the slightest hint, and only begged leave to recommend an implicit deference to the excellent judgment of Lady Russell, from whose known good sense he fully expected to have just such resolute measures advised as he meant to see finally adopted. So basically, Mr. Shepherd is declining to tell hard truths to Sir Walter and is instead like, I think we should listen to Lady Russell, because he knows that Lady Russell is going to say what he wants to say, but is too much of a coward to say, basically. Mr. Shepherd is their lawyer and like their advisor in their money matters for these purposes. Lady Russell was most anxiously zealous on the subject, and gave it much serious consideration. She was a woman rather of sound than of quick abilities, whose difficulties in coming to any decision in this instance were great, from the opposition of two leading principles. She was of strict integrity herself, with a delicate sense of honour, but she was as desirous of saving Sir Walter's feelings as solicitous for the credit of the family, as aristocratic in her ideas of what was due to them, as anybody of sense and honesty could well be. And so this is an interesting line here. So Lady Russell is kind of like in two minds here. Like, she's got, on the one hand, she's got a lot of integrity herself. She's very honest herself. She doesn't want to see the Elliots in debt, both because she thinks that it's a dishonourable thing for them to be doing, and also because she cares about the reputation of the family. But on the other hand, she is somewhat awed by Sir Walter's standing. Like, he is one whole step above her in the aristocracy, and or in the pseudo-aristocracy. And so she is a little bit of a snob and is deferential to him. And I love this little line, as aristocratic in her ideas of what was due to them, the Elliots, as anybody of sense and honesty could well be. And there is a real theme running through Jane Austen's work of people who are incredibly deferential to the aristocracy and their like social betters being mocked. So think of like Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice, for instance, and his kind of obsequiousness and his kind of not smirking, but kind of bowing and pandering to Lady Catherine, that being worthy of kind of contempt and ridicule. And here, Lady Russell is someone that, on the whole, we're told has good judgment, but we're also told this is a blind spot in her judgment. She was a benevolent, charitable, good woman, and capable of strong attachments. Most correct in her conduct, strict in her notions of decorum, and with manners that were held a standard of good breeding. She had a cultivated mind, and was, generally speaking, rational and consistent. But she had prejudices on the side of ancestry, She had a value for rank and consequence which blinded her a little to the faults of those who possessed them. Herself, the widow of only a knight, she gave the dignity of a baronet all its due, that being a slightly ironic all its due there. And Sir Walter, independent of his claims as an old acquaintance, an attentive neighbour, an obliging landlord, the husband of her very dear friend, the father of Anne and her sisters, was, as being Sir Walter, in her apprehension entitled to a great deal of compassion and consideration under his present difficulties. So she's a little too soft on him, basically. Oh yes, so should have made this a little clearer today. So Sir Walter Elliot is the guy, and for people of this rank of society, so it goes Mr. Surname or Miss Surname or Mrs. Surname, and then it goes Sir First Name or Lady First Name, and then it goes again at the higher tiers, Lord, like, seat, which is sort of semi-surname. So they are in the particular little slice of society, tiny slice of society, where, like, the proper way to refer to them formally is to use their first name. So Lady Russell's being a little bit what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, I haven't taken my ADHD medication today, so I may be like, what's the word I mean? A little bit more than usual. But Lady Russell is being a little bit deferential to them, a little bit soft on them. They must retrench. That did not admit of a doubt. But she was very anxious to have it done with the least possible pain to him and Elizabeth. She drew up plans of economy. She made exact calculations. And she did what nobody else thought of doing. She consulted Anne, who never seemed considered by the others as having any interest in the question. She consulted, and in a degree was influenced by her, in marking out the scheme of retrenchment which was at last submitted to Sir Walter. Every emendation of Anne's had been on the side of honesty against importance. She wanted more vigorous measures, a more complete reformation, a quicker release from debt, a much higher tone of indifference for everything but justice and equity. So they're basically giving Sir Walter a proposed new budget, and Anne is really trying to cut it down very strictly compared to what they had been before. "If we can persuade your father to all this," said Lady Russell, looking over her paper, "much may be done. If he will adopt these regulations, in 7 years he will be clear, and I hope we may be able to convince him and Elizabeth that Kellynch Hall has a respectability in itself which cannot be affected by these reductions, and that the true dignity of Sir Walter Elliot will be very far from lessened, in the eyes of sensible people, by his acting like a man of principle. What will he be doing, in fact, but what very many of our first families have done, or ought to do? There will be nothing singular in his case, and it is singularity which often makes the worst part of our suffering, as it always does of our conduct. I have great hope of our prevailing. We must be serious and decided, for after all the person who has contracted debts must pay them, and though a great deal is due to the feelings of the gentleman and the head of a house like your father, there is still more due to the character of an honest man." This is an interesting line here. What will he be doing, in fact, but what very many of our first families have done or ought to do? So what will he be doing in cutting back, but what loads of our richos will either be doing or should be doing? And she's saying, like, because everybody else is doing it, it shouldn't be that bad. And this is a time at which a lot of the, like, richest people's wealth was changing somewhat, and there is a huge number of economic factors into why that was. But the one that I am going to point out, because it is the one that is most relevant to what's happening in this book, is that there has been a big old war on with France. There has been the Napoleonic Wars, which obviously takes a lot of money. Wars are expensive. Okay. But that, like, to suggest that that is the only reason is incredibly simplistic, but that is the one that is relevant here. Where are we up to? Yeah. This was the principle on which Anne wanted her father to be proceeding, his friends to be urging him. She considered it as an act of indispensable duty to clear away the claims of creditors, with all the expedition which the most comprehensive retrenchments could secure. We do see this word retrenchments quite a lot, and it does mean like cutting back. And saw no dignity in anything short of it. She wanted it to be prescribed and felt as a duty. She rated Lady Russell's influence highly, and as to the severe degree of self-denial which her own conscience prompted, she believed there might be little more difficulty in persuading them to a complete than to half a reformation. Her knowledge of her father and Elizabeth inclined her to think that the sacrifice of one pair of horses would be hardly less painful than of both, and so on through the whole list of Lady Russell's too gentle reductions. How Anne's more rigid requisitions might have been taken is of little consequence. Lady Russell's had no success at all, could not be put up with, were not to be borne. What? Every comfort of life knocked off? Journeys, London, servants, horses, table, contractions and restrictions everywhere, to live no longer with the decencies even of a private gentleman. No, he would sooner quit Kellynch Hall at once than remain in it on such disgraceful terms. Quit Kellynch Hall! The hint was immediately taken up by Mr. Shepherd, whose interest was involved in the reality of Sir Walter's retrenching, and who was perfectly persuaded that nothing would be done without a change of abode. Since the idea had been started in the very quarter which ought to dictate, he had no scruple, he said, in confessing his judgment to be entirely on that side. It did not appear to him that Sir Walter could materially alter his style of living in a house which had such a character of hospitality and ancient dignity to support. In any other place, Sir Walter might judge for himself, and would be looked up to as regulating the modes of life in whatever way he might choose to model his household. So we're basically saying, like, the only way that they can really save as much money as they need to is to move into a smaller place, a smaller, less fancy place. Sir Walter would quit Kellynch Hall, and after a very few days more of doubt and indecision, the great question of whither he should go was settled, and the first outline of this important change made out. There had been 3 alternatives: London, Bath, or another house in the country. The country being the county. All Anne's wishes had been for the latter, a small house in their own neighbourhood where they might still have Lady Russell's society, still be near Mary, and still have the pleasure of sometimes seeing the lawns and groves of Kellynch, was the object of her ambition. But the usual fate of Anne attended her, in having something very opposite from her inclination fixed on. She disliked Bath, and did not think it agreed with her, and Bath was to be her home. Sir Walter had at first thought more of London, but Mr. Shepherd felt that he could not be trusted in London, and had been skilful enough to dissuade him from it, and make Bath preferred. It was a much safer place for a gentleman in his predicament. He might there be important at comparatively little expense. 2 material advantages of Bath over London had of course been given all their weight: its more convenient distance from Kellynch, only 50 miles, and Lady Russell's spending some part of every winter there, and to the very great satisfaction of Lady Russell, whose first views on the projected change had been for Bath, Sir Walter and Elizabeth were induced to believe that they should lose neither consequence nor enjoyment by settling there. Consequence meaning social standing. Lady Russell felt obliged to oppose her dear Anne's known wishes. It would be too much to expect Sir Walter to descend into a small house in his own neighbourhood. Anne herself would have found the mortifications of it more than she foresaw, and to Sir Walter's feelings they must have been dreadful. And with regard to Anne's dislike of Bath, she considered it as a prejudice and mistake, arising first from the circumstance of her having been 3 years at school there after her mother's death, and secondly, from her happening to not be in perfectly good spirits the only winter which she had afterwards spent there with herself. So she's like, Lady Russell's like, Anne says she doesn't like Bath, but that's only because she's had bad times in Bath. Lady Russell was fond of Bath, in short, and disposed to think it must suit them all. And as to her young friend's health, by passing all the warm months with her at Kellynch Lodge, every danger would be avoided, and it was, in fact, a change which must do both health and spirits good. Anne had been too little from home, too little seen. Her spirits were not high. A larger society would improve them. She wanted her to be more known. The undesirableness of any other house in the same neighbourhood for Sir Walter was certainly much strengthened by one part, and a very material part of the scheme, which had been happily engrafted on the beginning. Sorry, I've got something in my mouth. Something caught in my lip. He was not only to quit his home, but to see it in the hands of others, a trial of fortitude which stronger heads than Sir Walter's must have found too much. Kellynch Hall was to be let. This, however, was a profound secret, not to be breathed beyond their own circle. So that's because, by the way, Sir Walter renting out his home is like, that way people will know that he needs the money. And that would be dreadful. Yes, sorry. So, I should have mentioned this when Bath was mentioned, but I see that the chat is doing an excellent job of explaining Bath. Yes, Bath is so named because it is the part of England that the Romans built a load of Roman baths in. And you can still go and visit one of those today. Around the baths sprung up a bunch of social halls and socializing, and so basically it was a fashionable, not as seedy as Brighton but not as respectable as London, place to be seen for like fancy folk and middle class folk alike. It is sort of southwest of England, up near Wales. It's a very beautiful city these days. I didn't see it in 1815, but I'm sure it was lovely then too. Anyway, Kellynch Hall was to be let. This, however, was a profound secret, not to be breathed beyond their own circle. Sir Walter could not have borne the degradation of being known to design letting his house. Mr. Shepherd had once mentioned the word advertise, but never dared approach it again. Sir Walter spurned the idea of its being offered in any manner, forbade the slightest hint being dropped of his having such an intention, and it was only on the supposition of his being spontaneously solicited by some most unexceptionable applicant on his own terms and as a great favour that he would let it at all. So Sir Walter's basically hoping that someone really fancy will spontaneously ask to rent his house for whatever rent Sir Walter sets. Please, it will be a huge favour to me to rent your house at any price you set. And that's what he's expecting. How quick come the reasons for approving what we like. Lady Russell had another excellent one at hand, for being extremely glad that Sir Walter and his family were to remove from the country. Elizabeth had been lately forming an intimacy which she wished to see interrupted. It was with a daughter of Mr. Shepherd, so a middle-class woman, because Mr. Shepherd works for a living, even though he's a lawyer, which is one of the 3 acceptable professions. The military, the clergy, and the law. 3 acceptable professions. But even so. It was with a daughter of Mr. Shepherd, who had returned after an unprosperous marriage to her father's house with the additional burden of 2 children. Unprosperous marriage is really interesting here. It seems like what happened was she got married and her husband died and she is now a widow, but there is no money left. So she's had to move back in with her dad because she's got no cash and she's got 2 kids. With the additional burden of 2 children. She was a clever young woman who understood the art of pleasing at least at Kellynch Hall, and who had made herself so acceptable to Miss Elliot as to have been already staying there more than once, in spite of all that Lady Russell, who thought it a friendship quite out of place, could hint of caution and reserve. Of course, Lady Russell is a huge snob, but we will see that she also dislikes this woman in general. Lady Russell, indeed, had scarcely any influence with Elizabeth, and seemed to love her rather because she would love her than because Elizabeth deserved it. She had never received from her more than outward attention, nothing beyond the observances of complaisance, had never succeeded in any point which she wanted to carry against previous inclination. She had been repeatedly very earnest in trying to get Anne included in the visit to London. We dealt with the visit to London in the previous chapter. Sensibly open to all the injustice and all the discredit of the selfish arrangements which shut her out, and on many lesser occasions had endeavoured to give Elizabeth the advantage of her own better judgment and experience, but always in vain. Elizabeth would go her own way, and never had she pursued it in more decided opposition to Lady Russell than in this selection of Mrs. Clay, turning from the society of so deserving a sister to bestow her affection and confidence on one who ought to have been nothing to her but the object of distant civility. So it is very interesting that this book is saying to us that Lady Russell loves Elizabeth kind of because she has decided to love her rather than because Elizabeth deserves it. And the way that we have seen that Elizabeth does not deserve it is that Elizabeth refuses to be persuaded by Lady Russell into anything. Remember that the book is called Persuasion, and Lady Russell is constantly trying to give Elizabeth, often trying to give Elizabeth the advantage of her own better judgment and experience, but Elizabeth is always ignoring it. From situation, Mrs. Clay was, in Lady Russell's estimate, a very unequal, and in her character she believed a very dangerous companion, and a removal that would leave Mrs. Clay behind, and bring a choice of more suitable intimates within Miss Elliot's reach, was therefore an object of first-rate importance. Okay, we've got a question. Drut has already answered, thank you. Okay, sorry again, but by and large, can people read? So, middle-class people and above can read. That is not most people. And the literacy of the working classes is incredibly variable. And many of the working class could read a little or could write their name. Their literacy in terms of their reading and their writing were often completely disconnected also, not completely disconnected, but many people could write their name but not read, or many people could read but not write. But in general, middle classes and above could read. Anybody who could afford to rent Kellynch Hall would be able to read. And the actual problem with the advertisement and the announcement is that it will become widely known that Sir Walter Elliot needs money. Because the fancy thing to do, the assumption would be that if you're going to Bath, you're leaving your seat, your home in the country, your ancestral home, you're leaving that empty. Other people aren't going to live in that. You're just leaving it there with some servants maybe, to keep it nice while you're gone. You'll cover up the furniture with sheets to protect them from dust and stuff, but it's going to remain empty. So yeah, the embarrassment is that he's having to rent out his house. It means that he's in need of money. And yes, thank you, Drut. Speaking of advertisements that you want money, we do have a Ko-fi. So we do book club. I think it's great. Drut is our mod for all of our streams, mine, Johnny's, and MacGuffins. We have a team of absolutely wonderful mods that do really fantastic work and make this just an absolute joy of a community. And we think that it is very skilled work and like to pay our mods a living wage and also like to pay ourselves a living wage. That's very nice too. So if you can afford it and you like book club and you want to support it, you can drop a Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/Johnny and Sasha, or you can subscribe to the channel, or you can cheer bits, etc. And if you drop a Ko-fi or subscribe or something, you can leave a little message and then I will read it out to you. Toys I'll Curse, why is it embarrassing if he already collects money for tenants on the land? Because they are not living in his house. They are living on his estate. So his job, like that, his income is to rent out his land, his estate, which is huge. The people who rent his house is a small part of his estate, will not be getting the money from the rent from the tenants. They will just be living in his house. So this is to say, like, this says people, like, I need to let people into my personal space. The house is not the estate. The home is not the estate. It's the kind of, I can't afford to just leave my personal home empty. I need the money for it. If that makes sense. Oh my goodness, an anonymous gifter has donated 4 subs. Thank you so much. Yes, I do appreciate that the social, like, the particulars of the socio-economic situation are arbitrary and complicated, which is why book club is here, because these books are really, really good, realistic depictions of a very arcane and convoluted socio-economic time. I mean, all times and places, like all societies, are in some way arcane and arcane and convoluted. Understanding the particulars of a different society can be tricky. Yes, exactly. For Esima, it's like going from being a landlord to getting a lodger, you know? Or yeah, the difference between doing an Airbnb for your little granny annex and having to leave your house and rent out your house as the Airbnb while you go and live in the granny annex. That kind of thing. Okay, I think we've got time to do one more chapter, which is good because that will leave us on quite a nice little bit. Okay, so, chapter 3. I must take leave to observe, Sir Walter, said Mr. Shepherd one morning at Kellynch Hall as he laid down the newspaper, that the present juncture is much in our favour. This peace will be turning all our rich navy officers ashore. Okay, right. How much to go into about the Napoleonic Wars? Right, okay, so it's 1815. The Napoleonic Wars are about to come to an end. Nelson has, at the time that this is set, Nelson has just shoved Napoleon away in a corner and gone, nope. And the Navy has been instrumental in letting this happen. At this point, precise point in the book, we are several months away from the actual complete end of the Napoleonic Wars. But right now, it has been like 2 months since they have started to really wind down. Like, it is very clear that that England's going to win, and Lord Nelson, and the Navy are very much to thank for that. They're instrumental in that for sure. Okay. This peace will be turning all our rich Navy officers ashore. They will all be wanting a home. Could not be a better time, Sir Walter, for having a choice of tenants. Very responsible tenants. Many a noble fortune has been made during the war. If a rich admiral were to come on our way, Sir Walter, he would be a very lucky man, Shepherd. I've completely forgotten I know I only just did the voices a chapter ago, and I've forgotten what I chose for them. So please do compost witch. Yes, very much that. So please do forgive me if they change. They'll settle eventually. He would be a very lucky man, Shepherd, replied Sir Walter. That's all I have to remark. A prize indeed would Kellynch Hall be to him. Rather the greatest prize of all. Let him have taken ever so many before, eh, Shepherd? So this prize thing is basically when a captain or an admiral in the Navy takes an enemy ship, like conquers an enemy ship, that captain or admiral is then entitled to, allowed to say, that ship and everything in it is mine. So captains and admirals in the Navy in a wartime who are capturing ships can make bank. So that's what he's saying. Let him have taken ever so many before. Any, warships. Kellynch Hall would still be his greatest prize. Mr. Shepherd laughed, as he knew he must at this wit, and then added, I presume to observe, Sir Walter, that in the way of business, gentlemen of the Navy are well to deal with. I have had a little knowledge of their methods of doing business, and I am free to confess that they have very liberal notions, and are as likely to make desirable tenants as any set of people one should meet with. Therefore, Sir Walter, what I would take leave to suggest is, that if, in consequence of any rumours getting abroad of your intention, which must be contemplated as a possible thing, because we know how difficult it is to keep the actions and designs of one part of the world from the notice and curiosity of the other, consequence has its tax, basically being socially important has its drawbacks. I, John Shepherd, might conceal any family matters that I chose, for nobody would think it worth their while to observe me. But Sir Walter Elliot has eyes upon him which it may be very difficult to elude, and therefore thus much I venture upon, that it will not greatly surprise me if, with all our caution, some rumour of the truth should get abroad, in the supposition of which, as I was going to observe, since applications will unquestionably follow, I should think any from our wealthy naval commanders particularly worth attending to, and beg leave to add that 2 hours will bring me over at any time to save you the trouble of replying. So he's basically saying, look, this is going to get out. People are going to hear that you're trying to rent your house, and should any wealthy naval officers write, just give me, send a horse for me, I'll come over, I'll deal with it. Don't you reply, I'll reply. Sir Walter only nodded, but soon afterwards, rising and pacing the room, he observed sarcastically, There are few among the gentlemen of the Navy, I imagine, who would not be surprised to find themselves in a house of this description. So one thing about the Navy is that, unlike the Army, you could work your way up, basically. There were still some connections needed, but it was much easier for someone to work their way up in the Navy than in the Army. And therefore, snobs would look down upon it a little. Just making sure I've got my Discord up right. They would look around them, no doubt, and bless their good... Oh, sorry, that's not Mr. Shepherd. They would look around them, no doubt, and bless their good fortune, said Mrs. Clay, for Mrs. Clay was present. Her father had driven her over, nothing being of so much use to Mrs. Clay's health as a drive to Kellynch. But I quite agree with my father in thinking a sailor might be a very desirable tenant. I have known a good deal of the profession, and besides their liberality, they are so neat and careful in all their ways. These valuable pictures of yours, Sir Walter, if you chose to leave them, would be perfectly safe. Everything in and about the house would be taken such excellent care of. The gardens and shrubberies would be kept in almost as high order as they are now. You need not be afraid, Miss Elliot, of your own sweet flower gardens being neglected. As to all that, rejoined Sir Walter coolly, supposing I were induced to let my house, I have by no means made up my mind as to the privileges to be annexed to it. So, what the terms will be, what they're allowed to do. I am not particularly disposed to favour a tenant. The park would be open to him, of course, and few navy officers or men of any other description can have had such a range, but what restrictions I might impose on the use of the pleasure grounds is another thing. I am not fond of the idea of my shrubberies being always approachable, and I should recommend Miss Elliot to be on her guard with respect to her flower garden. I am very little disposed to grant a tenant of Kellynch Hall any extraordinary favour, I assure you, be he sailor or soldier. After a short pause, Mr. Shepherd presumed to say, In all these cases there are established usages which make everything plain and easy between landlord and tenant. The established usages, meaning, there's conventions. The conventions being that if you rent a house, you are allowed to use the garden. So he's doing, a very subtle, don't know if you'd get away with that. Your interest, Sir Walter, is in pretty safe hands. Depend upon me for taking care that no tenant has more than his just rights. I venture to hint that Sir Walter Elliot cannot be half so jealous for his own as John Shepherd will be for him. Here Anne spoke. The Navy, I think, who have done so much for us, have at least an equal claim with any other set of men for all the comforts and all the privileges which any home can give. Sailors work hard enough for their comforts, we must all allow. So we've got quite a different portrayal of the Navy here than we have in, say, Mansfield Park, which is an earlier book of Jane Austen's. The Navy had been thought of as very scandalous because it was very gay, and not just gay, but stuff happens at sea, and it had been thought of as quite scandalous. And again, because people can work their way up in the Navy, it was considered a bit of a there were people there who maybe were upsetting the social order a little bit. Here we've got a much more favourable view of the Navy, and as I say, where Anne's saying the Navy who have done so much for us, they have basically just won England this massive war. Very true, very true. What Miss Anne says is very true, was Mr. Shepherd's rejoinder, and oh, certainly, was his daughter's. But Sir Walter's remark was soon afterwards, The profession has its utility, but I should be sorry to see any friend of mine belonging to it. Indeed, was the reply, and with a look of surprise. Indeed, meaning seriously? Yes, it is in 2 points offensive to me. I have 2 strong grounds of objection to it. First, as being the means of bringing persons of obscure birth into undue distinction, and raising men to honours which their fathers and grandfathers never dreamt of. And secondly, as it cuts up a man's youth and vigour most horribly. So basically his 2 objections are this, you can work your way up when he thinks you shouldn't be able to, and secondly, it makes men ugly. A sailor grows old sooner than any other man. I have observed it all my life. A man is in greater danger in the navy of being insulted by the rise of one whose father, his father, might have disdained to speak to, and of becoming prematurely an object of disgust himself than in any other line. One day, last spring, in town, I was in company with two men, striking instances of what I am talking of. Lord St. Ives, whose father we all known to have been a country curate without bread to eat. Obviously, a country curate, a clergyman, would have been able to buy bread, but he is now Lord St. Ives. Interestingly, I believe Nelson's father was a clergyman as well. Maybe someone can fact check that for me, but if that is true, then this is like almost certainly a dig at Sir Walter for this particular viewpoint. I was to give place to Lord St. Ives and a certain Admiral Baldwin, the most deplorable-looking personage you can imagine, his face the colour of mahogany. So, of course, this may seem racial. It's not racial. It is, however, silly. So, of course, the idea back in the day was that a pale face was more beautiful because it suggested that you did not have to go out of doors to work. Having a tan was a suggestion, or even worse, like a sunburn, was a suggestion that you had to work in the sun. You had to work outside. So this is Sir Walter's issue. He, being so vain, will be keeping his skin completely out of the sun so as to stay as pale as possible. Yes. The most deplorable-looking personage you can imagine. His face the colour of mahogany, rough and rugged to the last degree. All lines and wrinkles, 9 grey hairs of a side, and nothing but a dab of powder on top. In the name of heaven, who is that old fellow? Said I to a friend of mine who was standing near, Sir Basil Morley. Old fellow, cried Sir Basil, it is Admiral Baldwin. What do you take his age to be? 60, said I, or perhaps 62. 40, replied Sir Basil. 40 and no more. Picture to yourselves my amazement. I shall not easily forget Admiral Baldwin. I never saw quite so wretched an example of what a seafaring life can do, but to a degree I know it is the same with them all. They are all knocked about and exposed to every climate and every weather till they are not fit to be seen. It is a pity they are not knocked on the head at once before they reach Admiral Baldwin's age. Nay, Sir Walter, cried Mrs. Clay, that is being severe indeed. Have a little mercy on the poor men. We are not all born to be handsome. The sea is no beautifier, certainly. Sailors do grow old betimes. I have often observed it. They soon lose the look of youth. But then, is not it the same with many other professions, perhaps most other? Soldiers in active service are not at all better off, and even in the quieter professions there is a toil and a labour of the mind, if not of the body, which seldom leaves a man's looks to the natural effect of time. The lawyer plods, quite careworn. The physician is up at all hours, and travelling in all weather, and even the clergyman. She stopped a moment to consider what might do for the clergyman. And even the clergyman, you know, is obliged to go into infected rooms and expose his health and looks to all the injury of a poisonous atmosphere. In fact, as I have been long convinced, though every profession is necessary and honourable in its turn, it is only the lot of those who are not obliged to follow any, who can live in a regular way in the country, choosing their own hours, following their own pursuits, and living on their own property, without the torment of trying for more. It is only their lot, I say, to hold the blessings of health and a good appearance to the utmost. I know no other set of men but what lose something of their personableness when they cease to be quite young. It's interesting for Mrs. Clay to say this, because her father is a lawyer, so one of these professions she mentions. It's very possible, and not just possible, but likely, that her late husband also had a profession. Sir Walter does not have a profession. So, as far as she is saying, only people like Sir Walter can ever be, can ever remain handsome past their youth. It seemed as if Mr. Shepherd, in this anxiety to bespeak Sir Walter's goodwill towards a naval officer as tenant, had been gifted with foresight, for the very first application for the house was from an Admiral Croft, with whom he shortly afterwards fell into company in attending the quarter sessions at Taunton, Quarter sessions are like important trials that happen every 3 months. And indeed, he had received a hint of the Admiral from a London correspondent. By the report which he hastened over to Kellynch to make, Admiral Croft was a native of Somersetshire, who, having acquired a very handsome fortune, was wishing to settle in his own country, and had come down to Taunton in order to look at some advertised places in that immediate neighbourhood, which, however, had not suited him. That accidentally hearing, it was just as he had foretold, Mr. Shepherd observed, Sir Walter's concerns could not be kept a secret, accidentally hearing of the possibility of Kellynch Hall being to let, and understanding his, Mr. Shepherd's, connection with the owner, he had introduced himself to him in order to make particular inquiries, and had, in the course of a pretty long conference, expressed as strong an inclination for the place as a man who knew it only by description could feel, and given Mr. Shepherd, in his explicit account of himself, every proof of his being a most responsible, eligible tenant. "And who is Admiral Croft?" was Sir Walter's cold, suspicious inquiry. Mr. Shepherd answered for his being of a gentleman's family, and mentioned a place, and Anne, after the little pause which followed, added, "He is Rear Admiral of the White. He was in the that's just a particular rank of admiral. He was in the Trafalgar action, and has been in the East Indies since. He has been stationed there, I believe, several years." It's interesting that Anne knows this. "Then I take it for granted," observed Sir Walter, "that his face is about as orange as the cuffs and capes of my livery." Mr. Shepherd hastened to assure him that Admiral Croft was a very hale, hearty, well-looking man, a little weather-beaten, to be sure, but not much, and quite the gentleman in all his notions and behaviour, not likely to make the smallest difficulty about terms, only wanted a comfortable home and to get into it as soon as possible, knew he must pay for the convenience, knew what rent a ready-furnished house of that consequence might fetch, should not have been surprised if Sir Walter had asked more, had inquired about the manor, would be glad of the deputation, certainly, but made no great point of it, deputation being the right to, hunt on the grounds. Said he sometimes took out a gun, but never killed. Quite the gentleman. Mr. Shepherd was eloquent on the subject, pointing out all the circumstances of the Admiral's family which made him peculiarly desirable as a tenant. He was a married man, and without children, the very state to be wished for. A house was never taken good care of, Mr. Shepherd observed, without a lady. He did not know whether furniture might not be in danger of suffering as much where there was no lady as where there were many children. A lady without a family was the very best preserver of furniture in the world. He had seen Mrs. Croft too. She was at Taunton with the Admiral, and had been present almost all the time they were talking the matter over. "And a very well-spoken, genteel, shrewd lady she seemed to be," continued he. "Asked more questions about the house and terms and taxes than the Admiral himself, and seemed more conversant with business. And moreover, Sir Walter, I found she was not quite unconnected in this country, any more than her husband. That is to say, she is sister to a gentleman who did live amongst us once. She told me so herself. Sister to the gentleman who lived a few years back at Monkford. Bless me, what was his name? At this moment I cannot recollect his name, though I've heard it so lately. Penelope, my dear, can you help me to the name of the gentleman who lived at Monkford, Mrs. Croft's brother?" But Mrs. Clay was talking so eagerly with Miss Elliot that she did not hear the appeal. "I have no conception whom you can mean, Miss Shepherd. I remember no gentleman resident at Monkford since the time of old Governor Trent." "Bless me, how very odd. I shall forget my own name soon, I suppose. A name that I'm so very well acquainted with. Knew the gentleman so well by sight. Seen him 100 times. Came to consult me once, I remember, about a trespass of one of his neighbours. Farmer's man breaking into his orchard, wall torn down, apples stolen. Caught in the fact, and afterwards, contrary to my judgment, submitted to an amicable compromise. Very odd indeed." After waiting another moment, "You mean Mr. Wentworth, I suppose," said Anne. Mr. Shepherd was all gratitude. "Wentworth was the very name. Mr. Wentworth was the very name, the very man. He had the curacy of Monkford, you know, Sir Walter, some time back, for 2 or 3 years. Came there about the year '5, I take it. You remember him, I am sure." "Wentworth? Oh, aye, Mr. Wentworth, the curate of Monkford. You misled me by the term gentleman. I thought you were speaking of some man of property. Mr. Wentworth was nobody, I remember, quite unconnected, nothing to do with the Strafford family. One wonders how the names of many of our nobility became so common. As Mr. Shepherd perceived that this connection of the Crofts did them no service with Sir Walter, he mentioned it no more, returning with all his zeal to dwell on the circumstances more indisputably in their favour, their age and number and fortune, the high idea they had formed of Kellynch Hall, and extreme solicitude for the advantage of renting it, making it appear as if they ranked nothing beyond the happiness of being the tenants of Sir Walter Elliot. An extraordinary taste, certainly, could they have been supposed in the secret of Sir Walter's estimate of the dues of a tenant. It succeeded, however, and though Sir Walter must ever look with an evil eye on anyone intending to inhabit that house, and think them infinitely too well off in being permitted to rent it on the highest terms, he was talked into allowing Mr. Shepherd to proceed in the treaty, and authorising him to wait on Admiral Croft, who still remained at Taunton, and fix a day for the house being seen. Sir Walter was not very wise, but still he had experience enough of the world to feel that a more unobjectionable tenant in all essentials than Admiral Croft bid fair to be could hardly offer. So far went his understanding, and his vanity supplied a little additional soothing in the Admiral's station in life, which was just high enough and not too high. I have let my house to Admiral Croft would sound extremely well. Very much better than to say any mere Mr. A Mr., save perhaps some half-dozen in the nation, always needs a note of explanation. An Admiral speaks his own consequence, and at the same time can never make a baronet look small. In all their dealings and intercourse, Sir Walter Elliot must ever have the precedence. Nothing could be done without a reference to Elizabeth, but her inclination was growing so strong for a removal that she was happy to have it fixed and expedited by a tenant at hand, and not a word to suspend decision was uttered by her. Mr. Shepherd was completely empowered to act, and no sooner had such an end been reached than Anne, who had been a most attentive listener to the whole, left the room to seek the comfort of cool air for her flushed cheeks, and as she walked along a favourite grove, said with a gentle sigh, "A few months more, and he, perhaps, may be walking here." Okay. So cryptic. Who is he? Who is he? We have gone like 4 minutes late. I'm very sorry, Drat. But we are now going to have a raid. And we are going to raid Drat. We're going to raid Drat. Drat, what are you playing today? Oh, thank you very much. Yes, Drat, if you like book club, we do have a Ko-fi. It's ko-fi.com/Johnny and Sasha. And the raid phrase today for Drat will be you're playing the chat will be, who is he? Although it feels really weird to have a raid phrase for Drat because she's been in the chat the whole time. She's the mod here, so having a raid phrase feels a bit weird. But yes, we will be having one, and the raid phrase will be, who is he? So, we've done pretty much all the setup for this novel, I think, and then we'll be really getting into the juicy stuff next time. So, thank you very much to everybody for joining me today. Thank you very much to Drat for modding, and thank you so much to the anonymous gifter who donated 4 subs. So, we'll be raiding Druttercup. There's no Drutterqo. Mistyped there. And the Johnny will be streaming on Friday, and the MacGuffin stream will be as usual on Sunday evening. And thank you very much for joining me. Bye!